Toxic people don't test you because they hate you. They test you because they're studying you. Every reaction you give them is data. And the moment you react emotionally, you just handed them the answer key. But here's what most people never realize. Toxic people only keep testing the people they think they can control. The second you respond differently, the entire game changes. Before we go deeper, if you've ever dealt with toxic people who constantly test your patience, make sure you subscribe and stay until the end, because the final strategy is the one toxic people fear the most. Toxic people often test boundaries because they are trying to measure how much control they can gain over someone. These tests are rarely obvious. They usually begin with small actions that seem harmless on the surface but carry a deeper purpose. A sarcastic comment, a dismissive tone, ignoring a request, interrupting you while you speak, or making a subtle joke at your expense can all be examples of these tests. The goal is not necessarily the comment itself, but the reaction it produces. Toxic individuals are constantly observing how others respond because those reactions reveal where the limits truly are. When someone allows these small moments to pass without addressing them, the toxic person learns something important. They learn that the boundary is flexible. To them, this signals permission to go a little further next time. It becomes a psychological experiment where they slowly increase the pressure to see how much they can get away with. What begins as a small joke may eventually turn into open disrespect, manipulation, or control. This gradual escalation is intentional because large violations would immediately trigger resistance, but small tests can slip through unnoticed. These boundary tests also serve another purpose. Toxic people want to understand emotional triggers. If they notice that a certain comment makes someone defensive or emotional, they remember it. Later, they may repeat the same behavior to provoke that reaction again. Emotional reactions give them leverage because once a person is emotionally overwhelmed, it becomes easier to manipulate the situation, shift blame, or control the narrative. The toxic person is not necessarily seeking truth or resolution. They are studying behavior patterns that give them the upper hand. Another important factor is insecurity. Many toxic individuals feel a deep need to maintain power in relationships. Testing boundaries becomes a way to reassure themselves that they still hold influence. If someone pushes back firmly and calmly, the toxic person quickly realizes that their control will be limited. But if the other person hesitates, apologizes unnecessarily, or tries too hard to keep peace, the toxic individual senses vulnerability and continues pushing. Over time, these repeated tests shape the entire dynamic of the relationship. The toxic person adapts their behavior based on what works. Every tolerated disrespect, every ignored boundary, and every emotional reaction becomes information they use to refine their approach. The relationship slowly shifts from equal interaction into a power imbalance where one person is constantly reacting while the other is constantly probing for control. Toxic people often provoke emotional reactions because emotions give them leverage. When someone reacts with anger, frustration, hurt, or defensiveness, the toxic person suddenly has something they can work with. Emotion creates noise in communication, and within that noise, they can twist words, shift blame, and redirect the focus away from their own behavior. What looks like a simple argument is often a calculated attempt to pull someone into an emotional storm where clear thinking disappears. These provocations are rarely direct attacks at first. Toxic individuals usually begin with subtle triggers. It may be a dismissive comment, a sarcastic remark, or a statement that questions your judgment. Sometimes it is a passive-aggressive joke that forces you to decide whether to laugh along or defend yourself. In many cases, they might deliberately misunderstand something you said or exaggerate a small mistake. Each of these actions is designed to press emotional buttons without appearing openly hostile. When the other person reacts strongly, the toxic individual learns something valuable. They learn which words create frustration, which topics cause insecurity, and which reactions are easiest to provoke. Once they gather that information, they repeat the same triggers in the future. It becomes a pattern where the toxic person knows exactly how to create a reaction whenever they want to regain control of the conversation or the situation. Emotional reactions also shift the balance of power. When someone becomes upset, they often begin explaining themselves, defending their intentions, or trying to prove that they are right. The more they explain, the more material the toxic person gains to twist or challenge. Instead of addressing the original problem, the conversation turns into a debate about tone, emotions, or personal flaws. The toxic person quietly moves the spotlight away from their behavior and places it on the reaction they just provoked. Another reason toxic individuals seek emotional reactions is because intensity gives them energy. Drama, conflict, and tension make them feel influential in the moment. If someone becomes visibly upset because of something they said, it reinforces their sense of control. The reaction confirms that they have the ability to influence another person's emotional state. Over time, this creates a cycle where the toxic person continues provoking reactions while the other person becomes increasingly exhausted. The more emotional the responses become, the easier it is for the toxic individual to manipulate the direction of every interaction and maintain psychological control over the dynamic. Toxic people rarely begin with obvious disrespect or open hostility. Instead, their behavior usually appears subtle, indirect, and sometimes even confusing. This is why many people don't recognize the pattern at first. The tests they use are small and quiet, designed to slip under the radar. A sarcastic comment that sounds like a joke, a passive-aggressive remark, sudden silence, ignoring a message, or giving a backhanded compliment are common examples. Each of these actions may seem minor on its own, but they are often deliberate signals meant to see how someone will respond. Sarcasm is one of the most common tools in this process. A toxic person might say something insulting, but hide it behind humor. If the other person reacts, they can immediately deny the intention by saying it was just a joke. This tactic allows them to deliver disrespect while avoiding responsibility. At the same time, they are closely watching the reaction. If the person laughs along even though they feel uncomfortable, the toxic individual learns that they can continue making similar comments in the future without facing consequences. Guilt is another subtle method used to test boundaries. Instead of asking directly for what they want, toxic individuals might imply that someone is selfish, uncaring, or disloyal if they don't comply. Statements like, "I guess you don't care about me," or "everyone else would help me," are designed to pressure someone emotionally. The test here is simple. Will the person give in to avoid feeling guilty, or will they calmly hold their boundary? The reaction tells the toxic individual how effective guilt can be as a tool of control. Silence can also function as a test. Sometimes toxic people suddenly withdraw communication, ignore messages, or give short, cold responses. This behavior creates discomfort because humans naturally want resolution and connection. When the other person begins chasing them for attention or apologizing just to restore peace, the toxic individual receives confirmation that silence can be used as a powerful form of control. Small acts of disrespect are another subtle strategy. Interrupting someone repeatedly, dismissing their opinions, or slightly crossing a boundary might seem insignificant at first. But these moments are rarely accidental. They are probes meant to measure tolerance. If the behavior is tolerated, it often grows stronger over time. Because these tests are small and scattered, they can be difficult to identify in the moment. Yet together, they form a pattern where the toxic person quietly studies reactions, learning exactly which behaviors they can repeat, escalate, or use to gain influence over the relationship. Your reaction teaches toxic people how they are allowed to treat you. Every interaction becomes a silent lesson about what behavior will be accepted and what behavior will be challenged. Most people believe respect is automatic in relationships, but toxic individuals do not operate with that assumption. Instead, they watch closely to see what responses they receive after their actions. Those responses become signals that guide their future behavior. When someone responds with strong emotion, long explanations, or repeated attempts to justify themselves, the toxic person sees opportunity. They recognize that their actions have the power to control the emotional direction of the conversation. This doesn't necessarily mean they planned everything in advance. Often, they simply notice patterns. If a sarcastic remark makes someone defensive, they learn that sarcasm works. If ignoring a message causes someone to chase them for attention, they learn that silence works. The reaction becomes a roadmap that shows them which tactics give them influence. Many people unintentionally teach toxic individuals to continue their behavior because they focus on keeping peace rather than protecting boundaries. They might laugh at a disrespectful comment even though it bothers them, hoping to avoid conflict. They might agree to something they don't want to do because they feel pressured in the moment. They might stay quiet when a boundary is crossed because they worry about creating tension. From the toxic person's perspective, each of these responses sends a clear message that the behavior is acceptable. Over time, this creates a gradual shift in the relationship. What began as a small moment of disrespect slowly becomes normal. The toxic individual becomes more comfortable pushing limits because nothing has clearly stopped them before. The dynamic changes without anyone openly acknowledging it. One person continues testing while the other continues reacting. Another factor is inconsistency. If someone challenges toxic behavior once but allows it several other times, the message becomes confusing. Toxic individuals often interpret this inconsistency as weakness rather than fairness. They assume the boundary is flexible and will continue testing until they find the exact point where resistance disappears. This is why reactions are so powerful in shaping behavior. A calm, firm response sends a completely different message than an emotional or hesitant one. When someone consistently shows that certain actions will not be tolerated, toxic individuals quickly realize that their usual tactics will not produce the results they expect. Calm responses remove the power that toxic people are searching for in the first place. Most toxic behavior depends heavily on emotional reactions. When someone becomes angry, defensive, or upset, the toxic person suddenly has something they can use. Emotional reactions create chaos in a conversation, and inside that chaos, toxic individuals often gain control. They can shift the topic, twist words, or portray themselves as the victim while the other person appears unstable or overly emotional. When a person reacts calmly instead, the entire dynamic changes. Calmness slows down the interaction and removes the emotional fuel that toxic behavior depends on. A toxic individual might make a provocative comment expecting frustration or anger, but when the response is steady and controlled, the reaction they were hoping for never arrives. This can make their tactic ineffective because the situation does not escalate the way they planned. Calm responses also communicate confidence and self-control. Instead of appearing shaken or pressured, the person appears grounded and aware of what is happening. This sends a psychological signal that the usual manipulation tactics are not working. Toxic individuals often rely on quick emotional responses because those reactions are easier to control. Calmness, however, forces them into a position where their behavior becomes more visible and harder to justify. Another important aspect of calm responses is clarity. When emotions take over, people tend to over-explain, defend themselves repeatedly, or raise their voice in frustration. This often leads to long arguments where the original issue gets lost. A calm response keeps communication simple and focused. Short, clear statements like refusing to engage in disrespectful comments or calmly restating a boundary remove the confusion that toxic people often rely on to dominate conversations. Calmness also prevents the toxic person from gaining emotional satisfaction. Many toxic individuals feel validated when they see that their actions have disturbed someone. The reaction confirms their ability to influence another person's emotional state. When that reaction never appears, the behavior becomes far less rewarding. Over time, the toxic individual may realize that provoking drama with this person does not produce the attention or control they expected. Remaining calm does not mean accepting poor treatment or ignoring problems. It means choosing control over reaction. Instead of responding with impulsive emotion, the person maintains composure and responds deliberately. This quiet control changes the balance of power because the toxic individual loses the emotional leverage they were hoping to use. Clear boundaries confuse and weaken manipulative behavior because toxic people rely on uncertainty. Manipulation works best when the other person is unsure about what they should tolerate and what they should reject. When boundaries are vague, inconsistent, or never clearly spoken, toxic individuals find space to push limits little by little. They test, observe the reaction, and then adjust their behavior to gain more influence. But when boundaries are direct and unmistakable, that uncertainty disappears, and the manipulative strategy begins to break down. A clear boundary is simple, specific, and calm. It does not require a long explanation or emotional argument. For example, calmly saying that you will not continue a conversation if it becomes disrespectful immediately changes the structure of the interaction. The toxic person no longer has the same freedom to provoke reactions because the limit has been defined. Instead of guessing what might be tolerated, they now face a visible line that they cannot cross without consequences. This clarity often surprises toxic individuals because many of their past interactions depended on hesitation. They are used to people softening their boundaries with apologies, long justifications, or nervous laughter. When someone calmly states a limit without hesitation, it interrupts that pattern. The toxic person may try to challenge the boundary at first, sometimes by joking about it, dismissing it, or pretending they misunderstood. These responses are usually another form of testing, an attempt to see if the boundary will hold or collapse under pressure. Consistency is what gives a boundary real strength. If a person clearly states a limit but does not reinforce it later, the toxic individual will quickly notice the gap between words and actions. They may repeat the same behavior to confirm whether the boundary was real or temporary, but when the response remains the same each time the boundary is crossed, the message becomes undeniable. The toxic person learns that pushing further will not create a different outcome. Clear boundaries also shift the focus away from emotional conflict and toward personal responsibility. Instead of arguing about intentions, tone, or misunderstandings, the conversation becomes about behavior and limits. The toxic person must either respect the boundary or face the result of crossing it. This removes the gray area where manipulation often grows. Over time, consistent boundaries weaken manipulative behavior because the toxic person realizes their usual strategies no longer produce control. The tests become less frequent because the results are predictable, and the psychological advantage they once relied on begins to disappear. Emotional detachment is one of the smartest strategies for dealing with toxic people because it removes the influence they are trying to gain over your feelings. Toxic individuals often rely on emotional hooks to pull others into conflict, drama, or confusion. These hooks can be criticism, guilt, sarcasm, or subtle insults designed to provoke a reaction. When someone becomes emotionally invested in proving their point or defending themselves, the toxic person gains an advantage because the conversation shifts from logic to emotion. Detachment does not mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means creating a mental space where another person's behavior does not immediately control your emotional state. Instead of reacting impulsively, you observe what is happening and choose your response carefully. This shift in mindset is powerful because toxic behavior loses its impact when it cannot trigger the emotional reaction it was designed to produce. Toxic individuals often expect predictable reactions. If they criticize someone, they expect defensiveness. If they ignore someone, they expect pursuit. If they make a sarcastic comment, they expect frustration. These patterns give them a sense of control because they know exactly how the other person will respond. Emotional detachment breaks this pattern. When the expected reaction does not appear, the toxic person becomes uncertain about how to continue the interaction. Another benefit of emotional detachment is clarity. Strong emotions can cloud judgment and make it difficult to recognize manipulation in the moment. When someone feels hurt, angry, or anxious, they may focus on defending themselves rather than noticing the manipulative tactic being used. Detachment allows a person to step back mentally and see the behavior more objectively. Instead of feeling trapped in the situation, they can recognize the pattern and decide whether to engage, set a boundary, or walk away. Detachment also protects personal energy. Toxic interactions can be exhausting because they often repeat the same arguments, accusations, or emotional triggers. When someone stops investing emotional energy into these cycles, the toxic person receives less reward from continuing the behavior. Over time, the lack of emotional engagement makes manipulation less effective. By maintaining emotional distance, a person keeps control over their own reactions and decisions. The toxic individual may continue testing for a while, but without emotional leverage, their influence weakens, and the psychological game they rely on becomes much harder to sustain. Consistency in your behavior eventually stops toxic testing patterns because toxic people rely on unpredictability in others to maintain control. When someone reacts differently each time a boundary is crossed, the toxic person sees an opportunity to keep experimenting. One day the behavior might be challenged, another day it might be ignored, and another day it might trigger an emotional argument. This inconsistency creates confusion about where the real limit is, and that confusion encourages more testing. Toxic individuals often behave like observers studying patterns. They watch closely to see when someone is tired, stressed, or emotionally vulnerable because those moments may allow them to push further. If a person sometimes enforces a boundary but other times lets it slide, the toxic person learns that persistence can eventually break resistance. They may repeat the same behavior over and over, believing that if they try enough times, they will eventually find a moment when the boundary weakens. Consistency removes that uncertainty. When the response remains steady every time a line is crossed, the message becomes clear. The toxic person begins to realize that the outcome will not change regardless of how many times they try the same tactic. Whether the behavior appears as sarcasm, disrespect, manipulation, or guilt-tripping, the reaction they receive is always the same calm boundary or refusal to engage. This predictability makes their strategy ineffective because the result is no longer influenced by pressure or persistence. Consistent behavior also builds credibility. Words alone rarely change toxic dynamics. Someone may say they will not tolerate certain behavior, but if their actions do not match those words, the statement loses meaning. When actions repeatedly reinforce the boundary, the toxic person starts to recognize that the limit is real. Over time, they learn that continuing to test will not produce a different outcome. Another important effect of consistency is the shift in power within the relationship. Instead of reacting impulsively, the person maintains control over how they respond in every situation. This steady approach reduces emotional drama and prevents the toxic individual from steering the interaction toward conflict. As the pattern continues, the toxic person often reaches a point where testing becomes pointless. They understand that pushing limits no longer creates opportunities for manipulation or control. Without that reward, the motivation to keep testing gradually fades and the dynamic of the relationship begins to change.